If the German generals had possessed a single, unified strategy on the morning of June 6, 1944, if the panzer divisions had rolled toward the beaches unopposed by indecision, if Hitler's command structure had functioned as a clockwork instrument instead of a bureaucratic labyrinth, would the outcome of Normandy have truly changed? This question invites us to understand something deeper than a simple narrative of victory and defeat. It pulls us toward the actual machinery of military failure, where ambition met exhaustion, where intelligence broke down into whispers and contradictions, and where the margin between empire and collapse measured itself in hours, in fuel reserves, in the hesitation of men reaching for telephones in the darkness before dawn. If you find yourself drifting off to quiet, detailed stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe. It is the simplest way to make sure the next long journey through the story of why did the Germans fail at Normandy, what Hitler's generals were facing, finds its way back to you. The story of why the Germans failed at Normandy is not a story of superior Allied tactics alone, nor of German incompetence, but of something far more intricate and human, a cascade of fractured decisions, competing visions, and the weight of an overstretched system collapsing under its own momentum. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden mechanisms, to the untold angles of history's decisive moments, consider following along as we explore these journeys through time together, slow, immersive passages into the moments when everything hung suspended. Now, imagine the Normandy coast as dusk settles. The light has begun its soft departure, turning the sky into gradations of lavender and deepening blue, and the Atlantic wind carries with it the salt memory of centuries. The wind moves across the cliffs with an ancient rhythm, the same rhythm that moved across them in June of 1944, though now it carries only the absence of what was. Below, where the tide pulls itself back from the shingle and the rocks, there are things that remain, fragments of the Atlantic wall, that vast defensive line that was meant to be impenetrable, yet became something else entirely. Rusted metal teeth emerge from the sand, like the ribs of some enormous creature left behind by time. Concrete bunkers, their faces scarred and weathered, still turn their blind gun emplacements toward a sea that no longer threatens them, their silence now complete and absolute. These relics lie half buried in grass and the slow encroachment of memory. Barbed wire, once wound tight and vicious with purpose, now hangs slack and ornamental, a museum piece of intent. If you were to walk among them in that dusky hour, you would feel something of what the defenders felt 80 years ago, the sound of wind, the vast openness of the sea, the vulnerability of men positioned against an approaching force they could not quite see. There is a peculiar quality to these remnants, a melancholy quietness that speaks not of glory, but of abandonment, of a vision that never fully materialized. The Normandy coastline in spring and early summer holds a particular kind of beauty, gentle, almost pastoral in its undulations. Wildflowers bloom across the cliff tops in May and June, small bursts of violet and yellow against the green. The fields behind the beaches roll inland in waves of cultivation, divided by hedgerows so dense and ancient that they seem part of the earth itself rather than placed upon it. This is the bocage country, the Norman countryside of small farms and tightly woven landscapes, where cattle graze and French farmers know every pathway through the green maze. At dusk, when the light softens and the shadows lengthen across these fields, there is something almost dreamlike about the place. Nothing to suggest the violence that once tore through it, nothing visible except the slow turning of seasons and the patient work of grass covering what was disturbed. Yet if you know where to look, the history emerges. In the villages inland from the coast, buildings still bear the marks of shell fragments, small white scars in stone that have become almost abstract, like artistic interventions in the facades. In the Norman earth itself, occasional metal detectors still pull up evidence, fragments of uniforms, belt buckles, coins, and personal effects that belong to men who arrived in those waters with different expectations than what awaited them. The museums scattered through the region contain photographs, documents, uniforms hung on mannequins, weapons arrayed in glass cases, all of it arranged to tell a story that somehow never quite captures the confusion and disbelief that men experienced in those hours. The coastline remembers in its way. The wind comes off the channel with the same force, following the same pressure systems. The tide still pulls back and forth with its ancient precision. The sea itself holds no particular allegiance to any outcome. What is remarkable is how quickly nature has reclaimed the space, how thoroughly the land has moved beyond what happened there. The concrete defenses remain because concrete is patient and stubborn, but even they are slowly being absorbed back into the landscape, moss creeping across their surfaces, weather slowly dismantling their edges, indifference completing what time began. This is the setting in which we approach the question of failure, not as a distant, textbook matter of strategy and logistics, but as something embedded in a specific place, a specific moment in June when the weather turned, when decisions reached critical thresholds, when the limitations of command structures were exposed by the simple demands of reality. The German generals who faced this moment were not operating in a vacuum of their own making. They were constrained by the architecture of the Third Reich itself, by Hitler's vision and volatility, by competing theories of warfare, by intelligence that had been systematically compromised, and by the sheer enormity of defending a coastline that stretched for hundreds of miles against an enemy whose true intentions remained obscured until the moment of revelation itself. In the dusk light over Normandy, as the sea continues its ancient rhythms and the wind carries the smell of salt and growing things, it becomes possible to glimpse something of what those men faced. Not with sympathy for their cause, which does not merit it, but with an understanding of how failure often arrives not through a single catastrophic error, but through the accumulation of smaller fractures, intelligence failures, doctrinal disputes, systemic rigidities, and the terrible clarity that comes too late, when the tide has already turned, and the beaches are already filling with the sounds of an invasion that should, perhaps, have been impossible. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to stand at the threshold of history itself, to inhabit the minds of ordinary people at the exact moment when the course of nations hangs by threads of luck and miscalculation, then you've found something worth following. These stories of how wars turn, how empires miscalculate, how the vast machinery of power grinds to a halt not with thunder, but with human confusion, they're everywhere, waiting to be uncovered in the fog between what was planned and what actually happened. The narrative we're about to follow here, this German failure at Normandy, it's not simply a story of guns and beaches and men dying in the sand. It's something deeper and quieter. It's the story of intelligence that arrives too late, of generals who couldn't trust each other, of decisions unmade in crucial hours because the person with the power to make them was asleep in a castle in the mountains. It's how fragile the greatest powers truly are when you examine them not from the distance of textbooks, but from the texture of real decisions, real doubts, real fatigue. If this is the kind of history that calls to you, the kind where you learn not just what happened, but how the people living through it experienced the weight of inevitability pressing down on them without their knowing it, then consider subscribing so you never miss these slow, immersive journeys into the hidden machinery of history's turning points. These are episodes designed to settle into you the way memory itself settles, gradually, without urgency or haste. Each one pulls back the layers of a single moment where everything could have gone differently, where the smallest shift in a decision would have rippled outward and changed everything that came after. Now, let's return to the Normandy coast in the early months of 1944. The wind is still carrying that salt-aged breath of the Channel. The bunkers are still being completed, still being reinforced, still representing what the German High Command believed to be an impenetrable line of defense. But unseen by anyone in Berlin or the coastal fortifications, something vast and intricate was already in motion thousands of miles away, a machinery of deception so elaborate that it would reshape what the Germans thought they knew about where and when the invasion would come. Word count. By the early months of 1944, the entire apparatus of German military intelligence had become a machine grinding in darkness, searching desperately for a light that would not come. Somewhere across the English Channel, in the ports and airfields of southern England, the Allies were gathering. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands upon thousands of ships, a force so vast that its very magnitude should have been impossible to hide, and yet the German High Command, despite all their listening posts and spies and reconnaissance flights, could not agree on a single answer to the question that had become the very center of their sleepless nights: where would they come? This uncertainty was not born from mere carelessness or stupidity, though history sometimes paints it that way. It emerged instead from a deeper problem, a fracture in the German command structure that had widened steadily since the campaigns in Russia and Africa. There was no single voice speaking with unquestioned authority. There were, instead, competing visions, rivalries that ran deep as winter snow, and a supreme leader whose grip on military strategy had become increasingly erratic and distant. Consider the geography of the problem as it appeared to German strategists in those winter months. The entire western coast of occupied France stretched for hundreds of miles. Normandy, Brittany, the Pas-de-Calais, the coast near Cherbourg, each region bristled with possibilities. An invasion force needed beaches where ships could unload. It needed room to maneuver. It needed to be able to advance inland towards strategically vital ground. But it also needed to be close enough to British airfields that fighter cover could be maintained over the landing zone. When you drew these constraints on a map, certain locations began to stand out. The Pas-de-Calais was the closest point to England. It was also the most heavily fortified by German engineers. Surely, the logic went, the Allies would take the shortest route. Surely they would assault the strongest point, proving their overwhelming numerical superiority. This thinking, reasonable on its surface, would become the very anchor that held German attention in the wrong place at the crucial moment. But there were dissenters, voices within the High Command who suspected something different. What if the invasion came further west? What if the Allies chose a wider, more roundabout approach? What if they would sacrifice the advantage of proximity for the advantage of surprise? These questions circulated through staff briefings and military dispatches throughout early 1944, but they never quite cohered into an alternative strategy. They remained whispers, doubts, possibilities that never quite hardened into conviction. The problem was deeper than mere uncertainty about geography. It was a failure of imagination combined with a failure of command structure. The German army on the Western Front was not a unified force operating under one clear doctrine. It was, in fact, deeply divided. In the north, around the Pas-de-Calais and the Belgian coast, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt held overall command of Army Group B. Rundstedt was a man of the old Prussian tradition, a professional of the highest order, respected even by his enemies. He had decades of military experience behind him. He had watched empires rise and fall. But Rundstedt, in 1944, was also a man of 70 years old, and he was operating within a command structure that increasingly bypassed him. Below Rundstedt, in theory subordinate to him, was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the commander whose reputation for boldness and tactical brilliance had preceded him across North Africa and now attached itself to his role as commander of Army Group B's forward divisions. Rommel had become something of a celebrity in Germany. The propaganda ministry loved him. Ordinary Germans saw him as the embodiment of military excellence. But Rommel and Rundstedt represented two fundamentally different philosophies about how to defend against an invasion, and by early 1944, this philosophical divide had become a practical problem that no amount of formal hierarchy could resolve. Rundstedt believed in the traditional approach: let the invasion come, absorb the initial assault, then, when the Allies had committed themselves and could not withdraw, throw the German armor reserves at them and drive them back into the sea. This required patience, a kind of strategic waiting that went against every instinct born of years of blitzkrieg warfare. Rundstedt spoke of this as defense in depth, strong positions at the beach, yes, but the real strength concentrated further inland, where German panzers could maneuver and strike. Rommel, by contrast, had been studying the nature of Allied air power. He had seen what happened when German armor tried to move in daylight without air cover. In North Africa, he had learned that lesson at terrible cost. In early 1944, looking at the strength of the Allied air forces gathering across the Channel, Rommel became convinced that any panzer reserve held far inland would be caught in the open and slaughtered before it could ever reach the battle. The invasion, he argued, had to be stopped at the beach. German armor had to be close, had to be positioned where it could attack within hours of the first landings, had to hit the Allies while they were still disorganized, still pouring off their landing craft. This required aggressive positioning, divisions spread forward, ready to respond immediately. These two visions were not merely different in detail, they represented opposite philosophies about the nature of modern warfare. They could not both be right. One of them would prove catastrophically wrong, and the problem was that neither man had the absolute authority to enforce his view on the other. Both reported to higher command, both sought to convince their superiors in Berlin, both hoped that events would prove their doctrine correct and vindicate their position. Above both of them sat the structure of the German High Command, the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. It was a structure that had become increasingly Byzantine, layered with rivalries between the army, the Luftwaffe, and the SS. It was a structure designed, in many ways, to concentrate power in one place, the office of Adolf Hitler himself. But Hitler, in early 1944, was not the man he had been in 1939, or even 1941. He was increasingly removed from direct military command. He spent much of his time at his various retreats, Berchtesgaden in the mountains, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. He was attended by sycophants and yes-men. He was becoming, in other words, a bottleneck through which all critical decisions had to flow, a bottleneck that was narrowing even as the stakes were rising. The intelligence picture that these competing commands were trying to assemble was itself a puzzle with missing pieces. The Germans had spies in Britain, or so they believed. Some of these agents had in fact been turned by British counterintelligence and were now feeding back information that served Allied purposes. German reconnaissance aircraft still flew over Britain, but increasingly they did so at night or at extreme altitude, gathering blurry photographs that often showed what people wanted them to show. Radio intercepts were made, certainly, but the signal was noise, a constant static of military chatter, much of it deliberately misleading. Where was the great mass of invasion shipping? It was there, somewhere, but German intelligence could not quite locate it. Where were the concentrations of troops? Intelligence reports spoke of gathering forces, but the exact locations remained frustratingly vague. In this fog of uncertainty, German commanders were forced to make bets. They gambled their positions and their doctrines on the assumption that they understood what was coming. And the most dangerous gamble of all was being made at the highest levels, the assumption, reinforced by a constant barrage of intelligence reports, many of them planted deliberately by Allied deception services, that the main blow would fall in the Pas de Calais. It was the closest point to England. It made logical sense. And it was where the Germans had concentrated their strongest defences. It was where they waited, watching the empty channel, while elsewhere on the coast, in Normandy, the true invasion fleet moved into final position, invisible in the darkness, undetected, carrying with it the future of the war itself. The question that haunted every German officer in 1944 was deceptively simple. Where would they come? But the answer divided the high command into factions, each convinced of their own vision, each pulling at the leash of command with ideas that could not be reconciled. And nowhere was this fracture more consequential than in the minds of two men who would never see eye to eye, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Desert Fox, and the old Prussian aristocrat, locked in a debate about the very nature of modern warfare. Rundstedt was a creature of the Great War. He had fought in the trenches, understood positional defense, the value of depth and reserves held far from the front. He was 71 years old in 1944, a man who had seen cavalry charges dissolve into machine gun fire, who believed that you could not win a battle by defending the coastline itself. The coast, he reasoned, was far too long, far too vulnerable to air bombardment, far too exposed to naval gunfire. Better to let them land, let them commit fully to the beaches, and then strike them inland with concentrated panzer forces held in reserve, armored columns that would wheel and counterattack, driving the invaders back into the sea. This was the doctrine of elastic defense, and it had a kind of austere logic to it, the thinking of a man who had spent decades mastering the choreography of mechanized warfare. But Rommel had seen something different. He had fought the British across North Africa, watched them use superior air power to strangle his supply lines, observed how Allied aircraft could turn a column into burning wreckage in minutes. He understood, with an almost visceral certainty, that panzer reserves held 50 miles inland would never reach the beaches intact if the Allies controlled the skies. And the Allies, he knew with crushing clarity, would control the skies. Every calculation he made led him to the same inexorable conclusion. The battle would be decided in the first few hours, perhaps the first few days. If the invaders were not destroyed on the beaches themselves, they would consolidate, and then no amount of counterattack could dislodge them. The margin of error was not 50 miles, it was measured in hours. So Rommel wanted the panzers forward, close to the coast, ready to move at a moment's notice. He wanted anti-tank guns dug into the dunes. He wanted the Atlantic wall bristling with obstacles and mines, a fortress at the water's edge. He pushed himself to exhaustion that spring, traveling the French coast in an open car, examining beach defenses, sketching improvements, radiating an almost feverish energy as he tried to transform intent into concrete and steel. He was 52, but he moved with the urgency of a younger man running out of time. He could feel something gathering on the horizon, some vast machinery of invasion being assembled across the channel, and he knew, with the instinctive certainty of a commander who had read his enemy well, that this would determine everything. And yet their disagreement went deeper than mere tactics. It reflected two different understandings of what war had become. Rundstedt represented the old guard, the officer corps that had grown up in the Prussian tradition, that believed in decisive maneuver and the concentration of force at the moment of breakthrough. Rommel represented something newer, something shaped by the marriage of tanks and air power, by the realization that the side with air superiority could impose its will on the battlefield, with a kind of terror that no amount of courage or discipline could overcome. Rundstedt's world was one of territory and position. Rommel's was one of time and reaction. And then there was the question of Hitler. Both men nominally answered to him, and through him to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, the high command of the German army. But Hitler had his own views, and his views changed depending on the mood, the briefing, the advice of whichever general had spoken to him most recently. He saw the panzer reserves as the crucial element, the hammer that would shatter any invasion attempt, and he was reluctant to commit them to forward positions without his explicit permission. This meant that neither Rommel nor Rundstedt could move their forces as they wished. They were constrained by chains of command that led ultimately to a man who would spend the critical hours of the invasion asleep, unreachable, guarded by officers too frightened to wake him with bad news. The tension between these three competing visions created a kind of paralysis, a system optimized for debate rather than decision, for consensus seeking rather than clear command. When you have two experienced generals disagreeing fundamentally about strategy, and a supreme commander who cannot decide between them, what you often get is compromise. And compromise in military matters has a way of satisfying no one and succeeding at nothing. The forward defences would be strengthened, but not as much as Rommel wanted. The panzer reserves would be placed closer to the coast than Rundstedt preferred, but not close enough to satisfy Rommel's sense of urgency. Nothing would be quite as it should be in the eyes of any of the men who had the power to shape it. And so the armies were arranged for the confrontation, as much by indecision as by deliberate planning. Rommel drove back to Germany in early June to argue once more for his strategy, to press his case with Hitler, perhaps even to celebrate his wife's birthday. He was physically exhausted, his health beginning to deteriorate, the weight of his responsibilities etched into the lines of his face. Rundstedt remained in his headquarters in Paris, aloof, professional, waiting to see what the Allies would do, confident that the machinery of German warfare would respond appropriately when the moment came. Between them, above them, the question still hung unresolved. How do you defend a coast that stretches from Belgium to Brittany? How do you stop an enemy you cannot see until the moment they appear on your beaches? How do you wage war when your enemy owns the sky? And yet, beneath the grand announcements and the photographs released through German propaganda channels, there existed a troubling distance between the myth of the Atlantic Wall and the fragmented reality that soldiers found when they arrived to defend it. On the maps in Berlin, in the ministries and command posts where officers pointed to red lines drawn across the French coastline, the Atlantic Wall appeared as an impenetrable fortress, a continuous ribbon of concrete, steel, and firepower, stretching from the northern reaches of Norway all the way down to the Spanish border. A barrier that would, as the official rhetoric promised, render any amphibious assault not merely difficult, but impossible. And there was truth woven through that narrative, to be certain. The engineering was real, the gun emplacements were real, the bunkers, the anti-tank obstacles, the mines buried in the sand, and the hedgehogs planted in the shallows, all of it existed. But propaganda and readiness are sometimes speaking different languages, and those who actually traveled that coast in the months before the invasion often found themselves confronted with an uncomfortable gap between the fortress they had been assured was waiting and the half-finished, understaffed, inadequately provisioned string of defensive positions that greeted them. Consider the sheer scale of what the Germans had promised to themselves. Thousands of kilometers of coastline, millions of workers and soldiers required to garrison and maintain such a presence. The Atlantic Wall was conceived during a period when German industrial capacity seemed limitless, when the Eastern Campaign, though grinding, still held the promise of eventual victory. But by 1943, by 1944, the resources that had once flowed toward such grand projects were being pulled in every direction at once. Factories that might have produced reinforced concrete were now producing ammunition. Steel that might have been fashioned into gun mounts was being melted and recast for tanks needed elsewhere. And the labor, the workers who might have been conscripted to dig and excavate and construct, were increasingly difficult to spare. What emerged instead was something more like a skeleton than a fortress. Certain stretches of coastline, particularly around the Pas de Calais, where German intelligence had been convinced the invasion would fall, received lavish attention. Bunkers rose in dense clusters. Anti-tank guns were positioned with overlapping fields of fire. The beaches there were seeded with obstacles, dragon's teeth and telemines and wooden stakes driven into the sand, all designed to tear open a landing craft or cripple a tank. In photographs, these areas looked formidable. And they were, but Normandy itself, the actual location chosen by Eisenhower and Montgomery, received a far more scattered investment. The bunkers that did exist along the Norman coast were often smaller, sometimes hastily constructed. Many were positioned to defend against a frontal assault from the sea, but less attention had been paid to protecting the inland approaches or considering how quickly a beachhead, once established, might expand beyond the range of the coastal guns. Some bunkers lacked adequate ammunition storage. Others were positioned on slopes where their fields of fire were obstructed by the very terrain that was meant to protect them, and in several places along what would become the actual invasion beaches, the defensive works remained incomplete. Barbed wire ran low in places. Minefields were thinner than maps suggested. Some positions that had been marked on German charts as fully operational were, in fact, still under construction or manned by exhausted garrison troops rotating through on duties that seemed, in the spring of 1944, almost ceremonial. Part of this reflects a deeper problem in German strategic thinking. The Atlantic Wall was conceived as a solution to a defensive dilemma that, in truth, had no perfect solution. The Allies could land almost anywhere along a 1,000-kilometer stretch of coast. They could choose their moment, their weather, their tide. The defenders had to be ready everywhere, all the time. Spread yourself thinly enough to cover the entire coast, and nowhere would you be strong enough to hold. Concentrate your forces, and you invited the Allies to strike where you had deliberately left weakness. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been sent to inspect the Atlantic Wall in late 1943, and what he found troubled him deeply. He toured the bunkers, examined the gun positions, walked the beaches where he imagined the landings would come, and he began to understand something that the High Command in Berlin had perhaps not fully grasped. The Atlantic Wall was not, and could never be, an impenetrable barrier. It was a delaying mechanism at best, a screen of obstacles and fire meant to slow an invasion, to disrupt a landing, perhaps to buy time for a coordinated counterattack. But it was not a wall that would, by itself, stop an invasion cold. Rommel began to advocate for a different approach. Rather than relying on the static defenses, the bunkers and gun emplacements and obstacles, he pushed for mobile reserves, armor units positioned inland that could respond quickly to wherever the Allies actually came ashore. The presence of tanks, moving and flexible, seemed to him far more valuable than additional concrete. But this, too, involved assumptions about where the threat would manifest, and it required resources that were increasingly scarce. There was also the question of command and authority over those resources, a question that would continue to fray German responses throughout the campaign. Which general controlled what? Who could order the movement of panzer reserves? How quickly could such movements be authorized? These were not merely administrative questions. They would, in the actual hours of the invasion, determine whether German armor could reach the beaches in time to contest the landings, or whether it would arrive hours too late, moving through a landscape already swarming with Allied soldiers and vehicles. The psychological dimension of the Atlantic Wall should not be underestimated either. For German soldiers, for the men who would actually stand in those bunkers or dig in behind those obstacles, the wall represented security. It represented the promise that they were not exposed, that they were part of a larger system, a coordinated defense. The propaganda reinforced this sense of protection. Photographs showed impregnable fortifications. Official communiques emphasized the strength and readiness of the coastal defenses. For soldiers far from home, in a war that increasingly seemed to be turning against them, this narrative was comforting. It allowed them to believe that their position, however isolated or uncomfortable, was part of something greater, something that would hold. And that belief would be tested most severely in the hours and days immediately following the invasion. Would the wall hold? Would the obstacles and bunkers and gun emplacements prove sufficient? The answers would emerge from the darkness of the early morning hours of June 6th, from the smoke and noise and chaos of those beaches where the reality of war, stripped of propaganda and stripped of the distance of command headquarters, would confront both the defenders and the invaders with stark and unforgiving clarity. And yet, as the spring of 1944 deepened into early summer, there was unfolding across England a pageant of illusion so elaborate, so carefully orchestrated across the full breadth of occupied Europe, that it would reshape the very calculus of German uncertainty. The machinery of deception had been turning for months in a program codenamed Operation Fortitude, and it would prove as decisive as any shell or sword in the waters and fields ahead. Somewhere in the English countryside, in forests and hidden compounds, phantom armies were being born. These were not men and machines in any real sense, but rather their ghosts, assemblages of inflatable tanks made of canvas and rubber, wooden gun emplacements painted with meticulous care, and radio traffic so meticulously crafted that it mimicked the signature and routine of genuine military formations. The 1st United States Army Group, commanded by General George Patton, existed almost entirely in the ether. It was a phantom force of nearly 1 million men, and the Germans were listening intently for every whisper of its movement. How do you make an enemy see an army that is not there? you create its voice. Across the radio frequencies monitored by German intelligence officers, the Phantom First Army Group transmitted signals of such authenticity that they became, in a sense, real. There were coded messages about troop movements, supply line requisitions, personnel transfers, discussions of landing craft assembly, and beach surveys. Every signal was part of a narrative, a story being told in the language of military communication, designed to lead German listeners toward a single conclusion, that the invasion, when it came, would fall not in Normandy, but somewhere far to the north, across the narrowest waters of the Channel, toward the Pas-de-Calais. The Germans had their intelligence networks, of course, and this was the true genius of fortitude. The operation did not ignore these networks. It fed them. Double agents, German spies who had been turned by British intelligence, men and women whose lives hung in the balance between two empires, transmitted information about the Phantom Army with the kind of scrupulous detail that lent them credibility. They spoke of vast concentrations of troops, of supply depots bulging with ammunition, of senior officers arriving to take command. Each piece of information was true enough to ring with authenticity, yet arranged in a mosaic that pointed always and only northward, toward the Dover Strait. There were other threads woven into this tapestry of deception. A disinformation campaign had been underway for months, planted in neutral countries and through various channels of communication, suggesting that Normandy was too well defended, too obvious a choice. The true strategic thinking, these whispers suggested, was that the invasion would seek surprise in the north, where German defenses were thinner, where the terrain offered better opportunities for rapid breakout. Every assumption the German high command might make was being gently guided, nudged by invisible hands toward a particular conclusion. Consider the problem from the perspective of a German intelligence officer, sitting in some headquarters far from the sea, trying to divine the intentions of an enemy whose resources seemed nearly infinite. You have photographs of truck parks, intercepted radio traffic, reports from agents in the field. All of it must be assembled into a coherent picture. The weight of evidence, as presented through Operation Fortitude, suggested that the invasion, when it came, would not be in Normandy. Normandy might see some diversionary feint, a smaller landing to draw German reserves away from the true point of attack. But the invasion itself would come in the north, and thus the bulk of German armor and the most formidable defenses should remain positioned there, waiting. This deception worked because it aligned with what the Germans wanted to believe. Hitler and his generals had invested enormous resources in the fortification of the Pas-de-Calais. To withdraw forces from that region would be to admit that those investments, that effort, that deployment had been misdirected. Fortitude did not so much convince them as it allowed them to continue believing what they already wanted to believe. It was, in a sense, a conspiracy of confirmation bias, where the deception and the prejudice reinforced each other until they became nearly unshakable. The phantom radio traffic continued right up until the night of June 5th, as paratroopers prepared their descent into the darkness above Normandy. The First Army Group was still transmitting, still preparing, still gathering strength in England. When German officers monitored these signals, when they read the intelligence summaries prepared by their analysts, they saw not the real invasion beginning to unfold beneath their feet, but merely the opening moves of a larger game still being played in the north. The reinforcements they might have rushed to Normandy in those critical first hours and days remained frozen in place, waiting for an invasion that would never come. What is the power of a story told with technical precision, with the language and rhythm of authentic communication? It can delay the decision of a general, hold back the movement of an army, and reshape the course of history. For perhaps 12 crucial hours, and some historians argue for as long as 48, the deception held firm. German reserves that might have counterattacked the invasion in its vulnerable beachhead phase remained immobilized, caught between belief in the Phantom Army and the growing reality of the landings in Normandy. By the time that reality could no longer be denied, by the time German commanders understood that Normandy was the true invasion and not a feint, The beaches had been seized, the foothold had been established, and the opportunity for a decisive counterattack had already begun to slip away. The operation was, in hindsight, almost perfect in its execution, yet it succeeds best when we understand it not as mere trickery, but as something far more profound, a kind of narrative warfare, where the truth and the false are woven so tightly together that the enemy cannot distinguish between them until it is too late. The wind that night across the Channel carried something the Germans could not yet name. Above the Norman coastline, somewhere in the thickened dark between the stars, the first transport planes cut their engines to a whisper. Thousands of men sat in holds that smelled of metal and fear and the particular staleness of confined breath. Their boots hung above the void. The moon was almost gone, which was precisely as planned. Below them, fields they could not see waited in absolute stillness. At almost exactly 23 minutes past midnight, the first paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began to fall. They stepped into blackness, or rather they fell through it, their parachutes opening like flowers blooming in the dark. Many of them had never jumped into real combat. Most of them were very young. The wind caught their canopies and scattered them across the Norman landscape like seeds, and in the scattering, the first threads of chaos began to weave themselves into the night. For the German defenders, the arrival came as a question before it came as a fact. The radar stations along the coast began picking up strange signals, aircraft, but in what formation, in what numbers, moving in what direction? The telephone wires that connected the German command posts hummed with urgent voices trying to make sense of a picture that refused to form. Were these bombers? Transport planes? Fighters? The answer kept changing, because different observers were seeing different pieces of a puzzle that had no center. Down on the ground, in pillboxes and dugouts, German soldiers heard the rumble first. It grew from a distant hum into something that made the earth itself seem to vibrate. Machine gunners cranked up their weapons and peered into the darkness, fingers hovering near triggers, waiting for targets that had no shape yet. Some of them thought they heard voices shouting in English, though the voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The paratroopers, once their feet found ground, found only confusion waiting for them. Equipment had landed in marshes. Men had been separated from their units by miles. Some units landed intact, ready to fight. Others scattered so completely that soldiers wandered through the dark for hours, looking for anyone they recognized. But what made this night truly crucial, what separated the possible from the actual, was not what the paratroopers did. It was what the German command did with the information they were receiving, or rather, what the fractured layers of German authority did with conflicting interpretations of incomplete knowledge. The reports began flowing upward almost immediately. At Army Group B, at 7th Army Headquarters, officers were waking to urgent messages, paratroopers dropping behind the lines, multiple drop zones, numbers unknown. The language in the reports itself held a note of panic, a questioning quality. Was this the main invasion? Was this a feint? The question was not rhetorical. It mattered enormously, because the reserves, the panzer divisions that might have counterattacked the landing zones and possibly changed everything, those divisions were not in Normandy. They were positioned further back, precisely because no one could agree on where the invasion would actually come. Rundstedt, the aging field marshal who commanded Army Group West and who had lost faith in the Atlantic Wall months ago, was not at his headquarters. He was at his residence in Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, which was to say, he was an hour or more away from the fastest decisions that needed to be made. Rommel, the desert fox, the general with the reputation and the will to act quickly, was in Herlingen, in southern Germany, at his wife's home for her birthday. He had driven there the day before, convinced that no major invasion would come in the next few days. The sea was rough, the weather was turning. The invasion could wait. This was not a small miscalculation. This was the difference between a general who could reach the phone in minutes and a general who was, in practical terms, absent from the field. Through the night, The reports multiplied. Paratroopers in the Cotentin, paratroopers near Caen, paratroopers behind the beaches. Most of them were right. The German intelligence was actually gathering accurate information. The system itself, though fragmentary and frightened, was detecting the drops correctly. But what happened to that information once it entered the German command structure? It encountered a thicket of uncertainty, competing authorities, and the weight of weeks of standing alert for invasions that did not come. The Wehrmacht officers at various levels had to decide what this meant. Was this diversionary? The propaganda had been so successful, the deception campaign so thorough, that many of them genuinely believed, or wanted to believe, that the main invasion would come not here, at Normandy, but at Pas-de-Calais, further north, where the crossing was shorter and the German defences were heavier. The Phantom First Army Group, the fake American army that existed only in radio transmissions and false signals intelligence, had done its work well. It was still doing its work. Orders, when they came down from higher command, still whispered about keeping reserves back, not committing everything to Normandy, because that invasion at Pas-de-Calais might still come. As the night deepened toward the false dawn that comes an hour before true sunrise, more reports arrived. Not just paratroopers now, ships. The radar was picking up a massive naval force. The invasion fleet was coming. This was the moment. And yet the moment did not produce decisive action. It produced instead a cascade of questions passed upward through layers of authority, each layer adding its own hesitation, its own need to consult with someone higher, someone with more authority, someone in a better position to see the whole picture. The confusion rippling through the German command posts was not the confusion of men who did not have good information. It was the confusion of men trying to interpret information through a lens of expectation that did not match what was actually happening. They were waiting for Pas-de-Calais. They kept seeing Normandy. The two did not fit together in their minds, so for many of them, neither quite became real. The reports of paratroopers kept saying Normandy, but the strategic intelligence kept saying Pas-de-Calais, and in the gap between those two truths, hours began to slip away. Consider for a moment what it might have felt like to be in one of those command posts that night. You are a German officer, perhaps a major or a colonel, trained to obey orders, trained to believe in a chain of command that is supposed to gather information at the bottom and make decisions at the top. The information is coming in now, urgent and disturbing, but the decisions are not coming down. Instead, the requests for clarification keep going up. What have we got? How many aircraft? What is the airborne strength? Can we get more reports from the observation posts? And as you wait for answers, for clarity, for someone in a higher authority to make a decision and tell you what to do, the night advances. The paratroopers are consolidating their positions. The fleet is drawing closer. The moment when countermeasures might have mattered is passing like a tide running out. By the time the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of grey, the invasion was no longer stopping in the night. It was becoming, instead, a fact that the day would have to reckon with. The paratroopers, scattered as they were already beginning to gather. The British and Canadian airborne divisions, who would drop on the eastern end of the invasion zone, had not yet jumped, but they would jump soon. And in the darkness of the pre-dawn hours, the one chance Germany had, which was to respond immediately and massively to the paratroop drops, that chance was slipping away into the past, lost not to enemy action, but to uncertainty, to competing authorities, to the simple, human paralysis of not knowing what was really happening when everything depended on moving as though you knew. As the darkness began to thin along the Norman coast in those early hours, a strange kind of clarity settled over the beaches. The mist rolled in from the channel, thick and formless, carrying with it the salt smell of the sea, and something else, something that the waiting soldiers could not quite name. Was it the smell of what was coming, or only the ordinary fog of a June morning? The question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, as men in grey-green uniforms peered out from their positions into that murky veil. On the American sector, where the beaches would come to be known by their code names, Utah and Omaha, Young German soldiers crouched behind obstacles and in concrete positions, their rifles resting across sandbags, their eyes straining to penetrate the mist. Some of them had been trained extensively in defense. Others were conscripts, older men pulled back into uniform after years away from soldiering, or younger boys who had known only war. The officers moved between the positions with quiet efficiency, checking fields of fire, reminding men to stay alert, though alertness itself seemed almost dreamlike in that grey half-light. The tide was coming in, as it always did. The obstacles, Czech hedgehogs and wooden stakes driven into the sand, each one designed to snare a landing craft and tear it apart, stood waiting like the bones of some vast creature partially buried in the beach. These obstacles were real enough. The threat, too, was real. But in the mist, everything seemed somehow suspended in uncertainty. Further east, along the British and Canadian sectors, Gold Beach, Juno and Sword, the situation was much the same. Thousands of German soldiers were distributed across these positions, occupying blockhouses and trenches, manning machine guns and anti-tank guns. Many of them had received orders in the preceding days, emphasizing that invasion would come, that it was only a matter of when, but when exactly. The uncertainty had worn on them for weeks. The constant alerts, the repeated stand-downs, the false alarms, all of it created a kind of psychological exhaustion that no amount of preparation could entirely dispel. Some men tried to rest, despite the tension. Others sat with their thoughts, writing letters home in the darkness, letters that would never be sent, or only sent long after the moment they described had become memory. What many of these soldiers did not fully understand, in those final moments before dawn broke fully, was that their own high command had failed them in ways both obvious and deeply subtle. The German leadership had never achieved true consensus about where the invasion would fall. Hitler himself remained convinced, right up until the very moment the landings began, and even beyond, that Normandy was a feint, that the real blow would fall at Pas de Calais, across the narrower stretch of the Channel, where the distances were shorter and the strategic advantage seemingly clearer. Rundstedt, the elderly field marshal commanding from Paris, had developed his own assessments that differed from Rommel's. Rommel, who had been recalled from Africa and given command of the armies in the north, held still different views about where reserves should be positioned and how mobile warfare should be conducted. These were not mere academic disagreements between distant generals. They were fundamental differences in doctrine, in strategy, in the reading of intelligence, and they meant that the forces facing the beaches were not arrayed according to any single coherent plan. They were scattered, duplicated in some sectors, dangerously thin in others, subject to contradictory orders and unclear chains of authority. The soldiers waiting in the mist knew none of this, of course. They could only experience their own immediate reality: the cold, the waiting, the sound of the sea, the fear that lived quietly in the stomach and occasionally rose into the throat. A machine gunner in a pillbox overlooking Omaha might have wondered if he would live to see the afternoon. A young man crouched in a trench at Sword Beach might have thought of his mother, or his wife, or the farm he came from, or simply of breakfast, which had not yet come. These were the textures of that moment, the human reality beneath the vast machinery of war. Strategy and doctrine were distant abstractions. What mattered was the mist, the waiting, the knowledge that something enormous was about to happen, and that nothing could stop it, though they would be required to try. The naval bombardment, when it finally came, announced the arrival with a kind of terrible finality. Ships had moved through the darkness toward their firing positions, and as the first light of dawn began to separate sea from sky, the guns opened fire. The sound was immense, rolling across the water and across the land, shaking the earth beneath the German positions. In that moment, the long period of suspense ended. This was real. This was now. And the men in those trenches and bunkers, however well they had been trained or however much they had dreamed of this moment, were about to experience something that training and dreams could never quite prepare you for. The ancient paradox of war asserted itself once more, that all the vast planning, all the strategy, all the movement of armies across maps, and the allocation of resources, and the calculation of advantage ultimately resolved itself into the experience of individuals in specific places, facing specific dangers, with only their courage and their training and their luck to sustain them. And while the first paratroopers were already drifting through the Norman darkness, suspended between sky and earth in those endless seconds before impact, another kind of darkness held sway far to the south and east. In the Bavarian alpine retreat of Berchtesgaden, within the ornate chambers of the Eagle's Nest, Adolf Hitler slept. The Führer, who had insisted on absolute authority over every strategic decision, who demanded that generals submit even their most confident plans to his personal approval, was unreachable, asleep. His door guarded, his schedule sacred, his rest protected, as if the survival of the Reich somehow depended on his uninterrupted slumber. It is difficult now, across the decades, to reconstruct the precise mixture of reverence and paralysis that governed the German High Command in those first crucial hours. But the historical record is clear on one essential point. Adolf Hitler had given strict orders that he was not to be disturbed before 10 o'clock in the morning. Not for routine matters, not for telegrams, not, as it happened, for the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Consider the position of the officers around him. These were men of the old Prussian military tradition, educated in hierarchy and obedience, yet they had also witnessed what happened to generals who contradicted the Führer. They had seen careers ended, reputations destroyed, sometimes worse. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, received the reports of the invasion through the night. Urgent dispatches confirmed that the Allies were landing in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall was being breached. Every moment of delay meant more men pouring ashore, more beachheads consolidating, more opportunity slipping away like sand through fingers. And yet, the Panzer reserves remained stationary. The 16th Panzer Division was held in place. The Das Reich Division was held in place. The crack SS Panzer Corps, one of Germany's most formidable striking forces, could not move without explicit authorization from Hitler himself. This was not mere bureaucratic caution. This was structural paralysis, written into the very fabric of the Nazi command system, a system in which all roads of authority led to a single man, and that man was sleeping. The generals faced an agonizing choice. Wake the Führer and risk his fury at being disturbed, or wait for his appointed waking time and watch the invasion succeed almost unopposed. Some officers, we know from later testimony, advocated for waking him immediately. The urgency was evident. The strategic calculus was obvious. Panzer divisions moved slowly, consumed fuel at prodigious rates, and required daylight movement to avoid Allied air attack. Every hour of delay made their deployment more difficult, more costly, less likely to achieve effect. Yet there was also the matter of Hitler's temperament. He was known to sleep poorly at night, to become irritable when awakened, to make vindictive decisions when roused unexpectedly. An invasion confirmed while he slept might seem to him like a failure of intelligence, a breach of his officers' competence. Better perhaps to let him sleep and present him with a fait accompli? To show him that his generals had the situation well in hand? This reasoning, if indeed it occurred, proved catastrophic. What makes this moment so strange to contemplate is that it reveals something perhaps deeper than simple military mismanagement. It speaks to the nature of totalitarian systems themselves, the way they concentrate power so completely in a single individual that the entire apparatus becomes dependent on that person's availability, his mood, his sleep schedule. A democratic military with a distributed command structure might have responded to the invasion with swift autonomy. Junior commanders would have had the authority to commit reserves. Division commanders could have made tactical decisions without consulting distant superiors. But the German army, like all institutions of the Third Reich, flowed directly upward to Hitler. Decisions pooled at the apex. And the apex was asleep. It was nearly 10 in the morning when Hitler finally awoke. By that time, the beaches were crowded with landing craft. Entire divisions were consolidating their beachheads. The window for a decisive panzer counterattack had narrowed considerably. Even when Hitler did receive the news and did authorize the release of the Panzer reserves, the damage was done. The delays accumulated. The divisions moved slowly, harassed constantly by Allied fighter bombers that hunted German armor with systematic ferocity. Roads were clogged. Fuel trucks struggled to keep pace. By the time German panzer strength could be brought to bear on the beaches, the Allies had landed so many men and so much equipment that the opportunity for a decisive response had essentially evaporated. There is something almost dreamlike about imagining Hitler's sleep that night. A man of enormous will and terrifying decisiveness, yet also increasingly detached from reality, increasingly dependent on stimulants and his personal physician, increasingly out of touch with the actual state of his armies. Did he sleep well? Did he dream? The historical sources are silent on such matters. What we do know is that he woke to news of catastrophe, and the first instinct of his mind was not to accept responsibility, but to blame those around him. His generals had failed. They were incompetent. They lacked imagination. They had not anticipated the Allies' movements. The invasion, in his mind, was their failure, not an inevitable consequence of Germany's overextension and the enemy's superior resources. The paralysis that gripped the German command, then, was not simply a matter of officers being too frightened to wake their Führer. It was symptomatic of a larger sickness within the German system of command, a system that had proven effective in the early years of the war, when bold, rapid decisions were needed, but that had calcified by 1944 into something far more rigid and far less responsive. Authority was concentrated, but it was also absent when most needed. Power was absolute, but it was also sometimes unreachable, and in the gap between those two poles, strategy foundered. Opportunities were missed. The war's outcome, perhaps, was sealed not on the beaches themselves, but in that quiet darkness of early morning, when a sleeping man held in his hands the power to change everything, and could not use it. Even as the first paratroops drifted through the Norman night, a far more tangled struggle was beginning in the German command structure itself, one that would prove as lethal to the Wehrmacht's defense as any Allied bombardment. The reality of June 6th would not be decided by tactical genius or fighting spirit alone, but by the fractured, competing visions of how Germany should respond to invasion, and by a command hierarchy so layered and suspicious that clarity itself became almost impossible to achieve. Erwin Rommel and Gerd von Rundstedt, the two commanders whose names held the most weight in the Atlantic Wall's defense, had arrived at fundamentally opposed conclusions about how to meet an Allied assault. It is worth sitting with this disagreement for a moment, because in many ways it captured the deeper strategic confusion that had infected German military thinking by 1944. Rommel believed, with the intensity of a man who had learned desert warfare the hardest way, that the invasion would be decided in the first hours and days. Once the Allies gained a foothold on the beaches, once their logistics began to flow across the sand, they would possess an almost unbreakable advantage in men and material. Therefore, German reserves must be stationed close to the coast, ready to strike immediately. Hit them while they are vulnerable, while they are still disorganized in the water and on the narrow strip of land. Counterattack with everything you have within the first 48 hours. This was not merely tactical doctrine to Rommel, it was conviction born from experience. Rundstedt saw it differently. The aging field marshal, grey-haired and methodical, believed that the Germans could not possibly hold the beaches against the full weight of Allied air power and naval gunfire. Instead, he argued for a deep defense. Let the Allies come ashore, yes. Let them establish their beachhead. But concentrate the panzer reserves, the real striking force, further inland, away from the devastating range of those naval guns and that suffocating air superiority. Then, once the Allies had advanced inland and become separated from their beach supplies, strike them with massed armor in the open ground, where German tactical skill and concentrated firepower could still make a difference. There was a certain logic to this approach, the kind that might look reasonable when drawn on a map in a quiet headquarters, far from the roar of combat. The tragedy or perhaps the inevitability, is that neither view would be fully implemented, and neither man had the clear authority to command decisively. Above them sat the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, which was less a unified body than an arena of competing power centers and wounded egos. Hitler himself had inserted himself into operational planning with micromanaging directives. Key panzer divisions had been withheld from the Atlantic Wall's immediate command and placed under OKW control. This division of authority created a situation where no single general could say with certainty which reserves he could move, when, or under what circumstances. Orders contradicted orders. Authority was unclear, and in those crucial hours after the first paratroops landed and the magnitude of the invasion began to become apparent, this organizational paralysis would prove catastrophic. Consider what happened in the pre-dawn darkness on June 6th. As reports flooded into German command posts that large-scale parachute operations were underway in Normandy, officers found themselves uncertain whether they had the authority to move reserves. The panzer divisions that might have counterattacked quickly were not under the direct command of the Normandy defenders. One division, the 21st Panzer, was stationed relatively close and could have potentially struck the beaches before the main landings, but its commander hesitated. Should he move without explicit orders from Hitler? Should he wait for permission from the OKW? The chain of command was tangled enough that precious hours were lost in seeking authorization. By the time those orders came, events had already shifted. The window for an effective panzer counterattack at dawn had narrowed considerably. Rommel, meanwhile, was away from his headquarters on the morning of June 6th. He had driven to Germany to attend Hitler's birthday celebration and to press, once more, for more defensive troops and supplies. Perhaps he sensed the imminence of invasion, or perhaps it was simply bad fortune. When news reached him of the landings, he began the long, tense drive back to France, knowing with a terrible clarity that his worst fears were being realized, and that he was not present to respond to them. The distance itself became an instrument of German weakness. Hours passed while he traveled. Decisions were made and unmade in his absence. The cohesion between his vision and the reality unfolding on the ground came apart. Rundstedt, for his part, found himself overruled in crucial moments. When he authorized the movement of reserves to counter the beaches, his orders would be suspended or reversed by officers junior to him in rank, but senior in Hitler's confidence. The very command structure that was meant to ensure rapid response, instead, ensured delay, confusion, and a kind of organizational paralysis where initiative was punished and caution was rewarded. A division commander who moved without authorization risked being blamed for insubordination. A general who waited for orders might find his enemy had already consolidated their position by the time permission arrived. This was not strategy anymore. It was bureaucracy wearing the uniform of war. The Italian general Alberto Pariani, observing German military organization during World War II, once noted that the Wehrmacht suffered from what he called the curse of competing authorities. No single person could make a decisive choice without checking with someone else. No order could be executed without reference to contradictory directives issued from different headquarters. This was partly by design. Hitler had deliberately created a command structure where rival power centers balanced each other, keeping him as the ultimate arbiter. But it worked perfectly only when Hitler himself was present and engaged. When he was asleep, or absent, or simply overwhelmed by other demands, the system became almost unusable. We might imagine the experience of a German officer on June 6th, receiving conflicting orders, uncertain of the true strategic picture, aware that thousands of men were dying but unable to move the reserves that might affect the outcome. The stress must have been almost unbearable. Some officers made bold decisions anyway, acting on their judgment and risking the consequences. Others waited for clarity that never came. In the fog of invasion, the fog of command was equally thick, perhaps more so. What made this situation particularly acute was that the disagreements between Rommel and Rundstedt were not matters of mere professional rivalry. though those certainly existed. They represented fundamentally different assumptions about how the war could still be won, or, more realistically, how it could be managed in a way that preserved German power and flexibility. Rommel believed the next 72 hours would determine everything. Rundstedt believed in preserving German strength for a longer war of attrition. Both men were experienced, both were intelligent. The problem was that the command structure did not permit them to test their competing theories against reality in any systematic way. Instead, it created a situation where elements of both strategies were attempted half-heartedly, where nobody received what they needed when they needed it. As the day progressed, and the magnitude of the invasion became clearer, the requests for panzer reinforcement grew more desperate. But many of those divisions were held back, committed to other theatres, or tied up in the endless cycle of authorization and counter-authorization. By afternoon on June 6th, the moment when concentrated armour might have made a real difference had passed. The Allies had established themselves sufficiently that driving them back into the sea would require not a swift counterattack, but a sustained, grinding campaign. And that was a campaign the Germans, stretched thin across an entire continent, could not win. The Germans, in the hours before dawn on that June morning, possessed something that looked on paper like considerable strength. Panzer divisions were stationed within striking distance of the landing zones, their armour heavier and more formidable than anything the Allies had brought ashore. Tank crews were alert, engines warming in woodland assembly areas across Normandy and beyond, and yet something essential was already slipping away from them in those dark hours, something that no amount of courage or tactical skill could restore once it began to vanish. That thing was fuel. Even as the first paratroopers were drifting down through the night sky, German quartermasters in rear depots were calculating a problem that had grown steadily more acute through the spring of 1944. The strategic bombing campaign, which had seemed almost theoretical to many soldiers, had become viscerally real to those responsible for logistics. Refineries had been systematically damaged. Rail lines that carried petroleum products from the Romanian oil fields had been cut. Synthetic fuel plants had been bombed into rubble. The Wehrmacht, that vast consuming machine, was slowly being starved of the blood that kept it moving. By early June, German army units in France operated under fuel rationing. Some panzer formations had orders prohibiting unnecessary movement, instructions designed to stretch their liquid reserves as far as possible. This was not merely an inconvenience of supply management. This was a strategic handcuff, invisible to the eye but crushing in its weight. A tank that cannot move is merely a bunker with treads. Its mobility, which is its greatest asset, becomes theoretical. And mobility was precisely what the Germans would need most in the coming days. When authorization finally came to move armour toward the beaches, the movement itself became an ordeal unlike any the panzer crews had known. Allied air supremacy, which had been claimed as an advantage by the invasion planners, but which now became almost abstract in scale, transformed the Norman countryside into a killing field for anything that moved by day. The skies above Normandy belonged to the Allies utterly. Thousands of fighter aircraft from the RAF and the USAF patrolled in a rotating carousel of wings, and anything that presented itself as a target drew immediate and devastating fire. Picture, if you can imagine it, the perspective of a panzer commander in his cupola, watching his column wind through the lanes and hedgerows of bocage country toward the sound of distant gunfire. The day is bright, the visibility is excellent, which means that anything moving is visible from above, and what is visible from above is vulnerable. The roads themselves become dangerous, visible from the sky for miles, so columns disperse into cross-country movement, into the narrow lanes between the high earth banks, seeking shelter in shadow. But this is slower. Movement that might have taken hours now stretches across an entire daylight period. A journey of 50 kilometers becomes a crawl, broken by sudden deaths from the sky. Strafing runs came with ferocious regularity. Jabos, the German soldiers called them, the Jaeger bomber fighters, speaking the word with a quality of dread that those who had not lived through that terror would find difficult to fully comprehend. A thunderbolt or a Spitfire would come screaming down at the column, and in seconds, the landscape was transformed into chaos. Men scattered from their vehicles, seeking whatever cover the hedgerows could provide. Vehicles erupted into flame, drivers slumped over their wheels, suddenly and irrevocably dead. The grinding of treads and the roar of engines would fall silent, and then, after the aircraft had passed, a terrible calm would settle over whatever remained. The arithmetic of these daylight movements was brutally simple, though few articulated it so clearly at the time. Every kilometre travelled in daylight hours was a kilometre purchased at a rising cost in men and machines. The panzer divisions that had seemed so potent in their camps were being consumed not in massive tank-to-tank battles, but in a war of attrition against an enemy they could not even engage. How does one fight back against something that owns the sky entirely? General Georg von Schweppenberg, who commanded the panzer forces in the west, reported in anguish after observing these movements that the concentration of armor he had envisioned was becoming impossible to achieve. Vehicles were being lost, not to tank shells but to cannon fire from above. Fuel trucks were being incinerated. Ammunition lorries were being set ablaze. The infrastructure of the Panzer Army was fragmenting under pressure it had no means to resist. And this was happening even as German ground forces were still attempting to organize their initial response to the invasion. The fuel shortage meant that panzer divisions could not be shuttled around the landscape of Normandy with the flexibility that modern armored warfare required. They were, in effect, locked into their starting positions. They would have to fight where they were, or attempt slow, exhausting movements to new positions, movements that cost them dearly every step of the way. This was not how panzer doctrine was supposed to work. Panzer doctrine depended upon rapid concentration, upon speed of maneuver, upon the ability to achieve local superiority at the decisive point and the decisive moment. And yet here they were, moving at the pace of their fuel reserves and the occasional pauses when death arrived from above. Picture the frustration of a divisional commander watching his armor being committed piecemeal, in penny packets, unable to concentrate for the massed assault that might still have driven the Allies back into the sea. The windows of opportunity were closing rapidly. The beachhead was being reinforced every hour. American engineers were building roads through the bocage. British forces were consolidating their positions. French and Canadian troops were digging in. And the German armor, constrained by fuel and harassed by air attack, was being fed into the battle one regiment at a time, at the pace of a shambling, exhausted march. Some panzer units would take an entire night to cover distances they had traversed in hours during peacetime maneuvers. The psychological cost was immense. Soldiers who had been trained in rapid warfare, who had built their understanding of modern combat around concepts of blitzkrieg and decisive, violent concentration of force, found themselves instead in a slow nightmare of movement and counter-movement, watching their strength drain away like sand through an hourglass. And yet they continued. This is perhaps what strikes deepest about the German effort in those first days and weeks after June 6th. Constrained by forces wholly beyond their control, fuel, air superiority, scattered command authority, they pressed forward anyway. The fighting in Normandy would be fierce and costly for both sides. The German soldiers would show the same courage and professionalism that their predecessors had shown in earlier campaigns. But they would do so knowing, even if not consciously acknowledging it, that the war of movement had already been lost, that they were now engaged in a struggle that could only end one way, and that the fuel shortages and the aircraft overhead were merely the most visible symptoms of a catastrophe that had already been written into history's ledger. Yet what the German commanders failed to fully appreciate, even as their defenders took position in those early summer days, was that the true fortress of Normandy had not been built by human hands at all. It had grown there over centuries, patient and indifferent, woven from the very earth itself. The bocage, as the Norman people called it, a landscape of dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and ancient stone walls that crisscrossed the countryside in a bewildering maze. This terrain would become something far more formidable than any line of bunkers or gun emplacement could ever be. Picture, if you will, the Norman landscape as it existed in June of 1944. Imagine standing in those fields where the Allies had come ashore and looking inland. What you would see is not the broad, open farmland that German strategists had perhaps imagined from their maps and intelligence photographs. Instead, the landscape rises and falls in gentle undulations, and it is divided, subdivided, truly, into small fields and paddocks, each one separated from its neighbour by towering hedgerows that could reach 10, 12, even 15 feet in height. These were not delicate garden hedges, they were ancient barriers, formed over generations, their roots so deep and their growth so thick that a man could scarcely see through them, and certainly could not pass through them without clearing a path. Between these hedgerows, the lanes run like capillaries through the countryside, sunken often by centuries of use, their surfaces worn down until they ran below the level of the surrounding land, creating natural trenches with banks on either side that rose above a soldier's head. For the German defenders, this bocage presented what seemed at first glance to be a tremendous asset. A soldier positioned in a hedgerow could observe the lane before him, could fire across it with relative safety, could retreat into the dense growth and be nearly impossible to root out. Machine gun nests, when properly sited along these lanes, could command approaches for considerable distances. Artillery positions hidden among the hedges could fire and then be moved before counter-battery fire could locate them. The terrain, in other words, seemed almost tailor-made for defense, for an army that was outnumbered and desperate to extract a heavy price for every meter of ground surrendered. But there is always a quieter truth beneath these surface impressions, and it is one that becomes apparent only through the slow experience of actually fighting in such country. The bocage, you see, is a landscape that abhors large-scale coordination. It fragments vision. It breaks an army into smaller and smaller units, until companies and platoons are operating almost independently, unable to see more than a few dozen meters in any direction, unable to coordinate fire or movement with units beyond the next hedgerow. For an army like the Wehrmacht, built upon principles of centralized command and coordinated operations, where officers relied upon maps and broad strategic vision to direct their forces, this fragmentation was deeply disorienting. Furthermore, and this is something that military planners sometimes overlook when they study a landscape on maps or through aerial photographs, the bocage was not a uniform obstacle. It was not a prepared defensive line where every position had been surveyed, every field of fire calculated, every exit and approach mapped. The Germans had not had the time, and in some cases did not possess the certainty of where the main invasion would fall, to fully prepare these hedgerows for defense. They existed as potential obstacles, but not as a coordinated fortress. Different sections were held by different units, with varying degrees of preparation. Some hedgerows had been reinforced with anti-tank ditches and wire obstacles. Others remained as nature, or rather, as centuries of Norman farming, had made them. And crucially, the bocage, for all its apparent strength as a defensive position, was equally effective at slowing down a retreating army. What provided shelter during an advance could become a prison during a withdrawal. Consider also the question of movement and supply through such terrain. A German armoured column attempting to move through bocage country faced a nightmare of tactical complexity. The narrow lanes could accommodate only single-file movement. A tank occupying a lane could not easily maneuver around obstacles. Hedgerows could be breached, but doing so took time and made a great deal of noise, announcing one's position to any enemy within earshot. The very density of the landscape that offered some concealment also meant that a mechanized force, and the Wehrmacht, for all its weaknesses in summer of 1944, still possessed superior armor, could not bring its advantages to bear. Panzer columns that might have swept across open terrain found themselves reduced to slow, vulnerable crawls through narrow passages where anti-tank teams could position themselves with relative ease. The bocage, furthermore, favored an attacker equipped with different tools, different tactics, different doctrines than the Wehrmacht possessed. The Americans and the British, though they too would find the blockade frustrating to fight through, had learned by 1944 to work in smaller units, to move with infantrymen and engineers, to call in close air support and artillery when they encountered serious opposition. They had learned to use tanks in support of infantry rather than as the primary offensive tool. They had learned, through hard experience in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, how to fight in broken, complex terrain. The Germans, by contrast, were executing a defensive battle for which they had not fully prepared, and against which their institutional knowledge and tactical doctrine provided limited guidance. There is also the matter of what historians sometimes delicately refer to as knowledge of ground. The Norman blockade, for all its apparent uniformity when viewed from a distance, was a landscape of subtle variations that local inhabitants understood intimately. There were lanes that appeared to lead nowhere, but actually opened into fields beyond. There were hedgerows that seemed impenetrable, but had been carefully maintained by farmers to allow passage at specific points. There were sunken roads that provided unexpected cover or unexpected vulnerability, depending on approach and timing. German soldiers, transplanted from Russia or Poland or France itself, fighting in a region many of them had never seen before, did not possess this intimate knowledge. The French resistance, the local population, and increasingly the Allied forces, who had studied maps and aerial photographs and conducted rehearsals with models of the terrain, possessed far greater understanding of how the landscape could be maneuvered, exploited, and navigated. What emerges from this consideration, then, is a paradox that lies at the very heart of the Bocage War. The terrain was simultaneously a shield and a trap, an asset that became a liability, a fortress that could not truly be held because it could not be properly defended as a unified whole. The German soldiers who found themselves positioned in these hedgerows, and thousands of them did, in the weeks following June 6th, would experience the Bocage as a place of overwhelming close-quarters fighting, where visibility extended only a few meters, where artillery and air power seemed less effective than at longer ranges, where every piece of ground had to be contested and held with rifle and grenade and machine gun. It was a landscape that made infantry combat intimate and terrifying and exhausting beyond measure, and yet it was a landscape that, paradoxically, could not prevent the Allies from advancing. It could slow them, bleed them, exact a dreadful cost in casualties and time, but it could not stop them, because the Bocage offered no position that could be held indefinitely without supply and reinforcement, and the fragmented German command structure and depleted reserves meant that such supply and reinforcement would come slower and slower as the days stretched into weeks. By the second week of June, as the Normandy beaches remained in Allied hands despite German counterattacks that seemed to drain men and machines in equal measure, there emerged a peculiar vulnerability within the German command structure, one that had less to do with fortifications or tactics than with the fragility of individual lives at moments when they were needed most. Erwin Rommel, the man upon whose shoulders rested the practical burden of holding the Atlantic Wall, had grown increasingly convinced that the invasion could not be stopped by defensive positions alone. He had seen enough of modern warfare, enough of air superiority and coordinated assault, to understand that speed and maneuver were the only remaining languages in which the Normandy campaign might still be spoken. So he drove. Nearly every day he moved through the Norman countryside in his staff car, visiting forward positions, assessing the reality beneath the optimistic reports filtering back to higher command, trying to inject a kind of restless urgency into a defense that was already beginning to feel like a slow drowning. On July 17th, as he was returning from a reconnaissance mission to the front lines, traveling along a country road near the village of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery, his Horch staff car encountered something that no amount of tactical brilliance could defend against. It was afternoon, the summer light still bright, and Rommel's driver was moving quickly through a landscape where the hedgerows, those thick bocage barriers that had become both refuge and prison for German defenders, created sudden blind turns and channels of vulnerability. Two RAF Typhoon fighters, part of the constant Allied air patrols that had become as much a feature of the Norman sky as clouds, spotted the vehicle and attacked. There are accounts that suggest Rommel saw them coming, that he shouted a warning, that he threw himself to the floor of the car in that final moment before the cannon fire shredded the vehicle. His driver was killed instantly. Rommel was thrown from the wreckage, his head and face traumatized by the impact, his skull fractured in ways that would take weeks to properly heal, if healing was even the right word for the long, uncertain recovery that followed. What happened in those immediate hours after Rommel's wounding was, in its way, as consequential as any tactical maneuver that had preceded it. The news moved slowly through the chain of command, uncertainty at first about whether he was even alive, then confusion about the extent of his injuries, then the peculiar administrative lag that characterizes any command structure suddenly deprived of its most visible figure. Rommel was rushed to a hospital in Liège, then eventually evacuated further back, away from the front, away from the daily crucible of decision-making, where his restless energy had become almost the only antidote to the gathering sense that the German position was becoming untenable. In his absence, there was no one to fill the particular role he had played, not because others lacked competence, but because Rommel had become, in those early weeks of the campaign, a symbol of resistance, almost a talisman against the creeping dread that was beginning to settle over the German defenders, like morning fog that refuses to lift. The impact of his absence was subtler than a single dramatic decision might have been, but perhaps for that reason it was more corrosive. The German counterattacks continued. They had to continue, because the orders from Hitler still demanded them, but they began to carry a different character. There was less of the carefully orchestrated momentum, the sense of a man who understood modern warfare pressing every advantage, calculating probabilities, choosing battles with the precision of someone who knew exactly how scarce the remaining resources truly were. Instead, there emerged an almost mechanical quality to German operations, a repetition of attacks that, while they still inflicted tremendous casualties on the Allies and still tied down vast resources, seemed increasingly disconnected from any coherent strategic purpose. It was as though Rommel's wounding had removed not just a commander, but the very logic of how the campaign was being conducted. And the soldiers themselves felt it. There is something difficult to quantify, but unmistakable in the records of those who were actually in the Norman bocage during those final days of July and into August. A shift in tone, a slight but palpable erosion of hope. Rommel had cultivated a reputation, particularly among the Afrika Korps veterans who had served under him across North Africa, as a general who understood the realities of modern warfare, and who, when he gave an order, seemed to have calculated the probabilities in a way that suggested at least the possibility of success. With him suddenly gone, and with Hitler's grandiose demands for counterattacks continuing to arrive from Berchtesgaden, there was a peculiar despair that began to settle into the ranks. Officers who had been willing to attempt impossible maneuvers when they believed they were being directed by Rommel found themselves executing those same maneuvers with a deepening sense of futility when the orders came from sources that seemed increasingly disconnected from ground reality. The wound itself was serious, a fractured skull, injuries to his eyes, damage that left Rommel struggling with equilibrium and vision for months afterward. But what may have mattered more, in the vast architecture of how armies collapse, was not the physical damage, but the symbolic loss. Hitler did not allow Rommel to return to active command. Whether this was from genuine concern for his recovery, or from the Führer's growing suspicion of his general's loyalty, or from some combination of both, the effect was the same. The man who had understood that the battle for Normandy could not be won through static defense, who had lobbied for mobile response and flexible tactics, was simply gone. In his place remained the careful structures of the chain of command, the competing egos and jurisdictions of Rundstedt and the OKW, and the various corps commanders, each of whom had their own vision for how to conduct the campaign, but none of whom carried quite the same weight of demonstrated competence in the specific calculus of defending a beachhead against overwhelming odds. What followed was a kind of gradual disintegration, disguised as continued military operations. The German forces in Normandy would continue to fight with remarkable tenacity for another month, but it was increasingly the tenacity of soldiers and junior officers trying to hold a position they understood was already lost, rather than the coordinated resistance of an army that believed in its eventual success. The losses accumulated. The flanks began to crumble more noticeably as Americans ground their way inland, and British and Canadian forces pressed from the east. And somewhere in a hospital room far from the front, Rommel lay recovering from wounds that he would never fully overcome, unable to witness the final collapse of the defense he had warned was impossible to sustain. Which raises perhaps the gentlest of ironies in the terrible arithmetic of military history, that sometimes a general's greatest service to his army may be forced absence, an accidental removal from the machinery that grinds on without him, leaving those beneath him to contend with the wreckage of strategies he had already recognized as doomed. By late August, the German forces in Normandy had begun to understand a terrible geometry of their own making. The advance of the American armies from the Cotentin Peninsula and the British and Canadian pushes from the eastern beachheads had started to form a closing arc, a slow and inexorable tightening around a shrinking pocket of German-held terrain. Historians call this the Falaise Pocket, named for a modest Norman town that would become synonymous with one of World War II's most catastrophic encirclements. But the pocket was not created in a single moment of clarity or a sudden tactical revelation. It bled into existence, day by slow day, through thousands of small decisions made under impossible pressure. Field Marshal Rundstedt had already been dismissed by this point, relieved of command for his frank assessments to Hitler that the situation was no longer retrievable. His replacement, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, arrived to inherit a command that was dissolving even as he took the reins. The lines on the map that had once suggested defensive positions began to curve inward. German units that had been fighting for weeks in the Norman bocage found themselves suddenly fighting not forward but rearward, trying to maintain a perimeter against encroaching Allied forces. The hedgerows that had once been strongholds became traps. The narrow lanes that had funneled attackers now carried refugees, wounded men, and the vehicles of a retreating army, all compressed into an ever smaller area. The Americans under General Omar Bradley had driven south from the Cotentin and then wheeled east, their armor and motorized infantry moving with a speed that German command could scarcely coordinate against. The British and Canadians under Montgomery pushed down from the north toward Falaise. What had seemed, in early June, like a manageable defense of the Atlantic Wall had become by late August something far more desperate. The Wehrmacht could not break out eastward without facing the consolidated fire of armies that now had complete air superiority. They could not hold their ground indefinitely. They could not retreat in good order. They were, in the most literal sense, being squeezed. Inside the pocket, supplies dwindled with each passing day. Fuel was nearly non-existent. The Luftwaffe, already reduced to a handful of serviceable aircraft, could mount no real defense against the American and British fighters that owned the sky. German officers looked at their maps and saw the distance between their positions and the Seine River beyond. The river that had once been a natural obstacle, but now represented a final hope of escape. Some units chose to remain and fight, knowing the war was lost, but hoping to extract their comrades. Others pushed toward any gap in the Allied lines, desperate to cross before the pocket sealed completely. And it was not as though the Allies simply turned a key and slammed the door shut. The encirclement was contested ground, and German generals threw what resources they could spare into attempts to break the closing ring. Panzer divisions, depleted though they were, lashed out in counterattacks that bought a few more hours of movement for the columns streaming toward the gap near Falaise. But each counterattack cost fuel, cost tank crews, cost ammunition that could not be replaced. The mathematics of the situation favored only one outcome, and yet the fighting went on, day after day, because surrender was not an option that German officers were culturally or politically prepared to consider. The human cost of this compression was almost unimaginable. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were packed into an area that shrank by the hour. Medical facilities, established for a war of maneuver, collapsed under the weight of casualties far beyond their capacity. The roads became choked with vehicles unable to move, vulnerable to Allied aircraft that operated almost unopposed in daylight hours. Columns of German infantry marched alongside streams of refugees, all trying to reach the same narrow escape routes. Officers struggled to maintain any semblance of order or cohesion. Units that had fought together for months fragmented into scattered groups seeking their own route to safety. What began to happen then was something that historians have since described as a cascade of small collapses. German units did not surrender en masse in the pocket, at least not at first. What occurred instead was a dissolution of command authority through attrition and exhaustion. Officers made the best decisions they could with the information they possessed, and those decisions cascaded downward through the chain of command. A colonel might order a holding action to buy time for other units to escape. A sergeant might make the judgment that his men had done what could reasonably be expected and lead them toward the lines of advancing Americans with hands raised. A major might feel his authority slipping as his exhausted men simply sat down by the roadside, too broken by weeks of combat to respond any longer to orders. The pocket's closure accelerated rapidly in the final days of August. The gap near Falaise, which had been perhaps 10 miles wide, narrowed to 5 miles, then 3. German generals made last desperate attempts to maintain some kind of unified defense of the shrinking perimeter, but the coordination required for such a thing became increasingly impossible. Radio communications broke down. Supply lines ceased to exist. The very concept of a coherent front dissolved into what amounted to desperate pockets of organized resistance scattered across the Norman landscape. Some German soldiers and officers managed to slip through the tightening noose, crossing toward the east and the Seine. Many others found themselves simply cut off, surrounded on all sides by Allied armor and infantry. By the time the pocket closed entirely, in the second week of August, it is worth pausing here to feel the weight of that timeline, how compressed the final act became. Perhaps 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Wehrmacht had lost vastly more, killed and wounded, across the entire Normandy campaign. Equipment abandoned or destroyed, numbered in the thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks and guns. The organized coherence of the German army in France, once formidable enough to worry Allied planners, had been reduced to fragments and scattered remnants. What is perhaps most striking, when one considers the slow unfolding of the Falaise encirclement, is how little room there had been for German error from the very beginning. The Wehrmacht had been given perhaps 2 weeks, in a generous estimate, to repel the initial landings or inflict enough damage to make the invasion untenable. That window had closed. By the time the High Command had accumulated enough information to truly understand the scope of the Allied commitment, by the time panzer reserves had been gathered and deployed, by the time the true size and composition of the Allied armies had become clear, the opportunity had already passed into history. The Falaise Pocket was not the failure that lost Normandy. It was, instead, the visible result of failures that had accumulated across the entire length of the campaign, now being compressed into a single terrible space, where the consequences could no longer be negotiated away or explained by generals to an increasingly disconnected Führer in his mountain retreat. What remains of those men, now, is mostly silence. The letters they managed to write home were often seized, censored, or simply never sent. But in the archives, tucked inside faded envelopes in German military museums, preserved in private collections that families kept through the decades, there are fragments, whispers really, of what those defenders were thinking and feeling as the days stretched into weeks of grinding, hopeless combat in the Norman bocage. Consider the diary of a young Obergefreiter, a lance corporal, with the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, written in the margin of a pocket calendar sometime in mid-June. He was barely 20 years old. His entry reads, in translation, something like this: "We have been told we are winning. The generals say the invasion will be pushed back into the sea within days, but I see the faces of the men around me. I see the sky full of Allied planes at dawn. Where is our Luftwaffe? Where are our reinforcements? The tone itself is not quite despair, but a kind of exhausted confusion. The gap between what he had been promised and what his own eyes were telling him had become too wide to ignore. There is a quietness in that contradiction, isn't there? The weight of being young and caught between belief and reality. A Wehrmacht officer, a captain, with the 352nd Infantry Division, dug into the bluffs above Omaha Beach, kept notes on the back of military forms. Days after the initial landings, when it had become clear that the beachhead would not be compressed, his handwriting grew smaller, tighter. "The men are exhausted," he wrote. "We have had no proper relief. The bombardment continues at all hours. How long can flesh and nerve endure this? I do not know if it is cowardice to think we cannot hold forever, or wisdom. There is something profoundly human in that question, isn't it? The quiet torment of a soldier who can see clearly that hope itself is becoming a luxury." The physical reality beneath these words was unimaginable. By the third week of the Normandy campaign, many German units had been reduced to perhaps half their original strength. The bocage, those ancient, dense hedgerows that crisscrossed the Norman countryside, offered shelter of a kind, but it also meant men were rarely out of the sound of artillery or small arms fire. Sleep became a rare and precious thing. A sergeant with the Panzer Lehr Division, in a letter home that was never delivered until long after the war, described trying to rest in the mud under a tank. "The ground is cold and wet. The smell of fuel and fear mixes with the earth. I dream of my mother's kitchen, warm bread, coffee without grit in it. When I wake, for a moment I believe I am home. Then the mortars begin again. That cruel cycle of dreams interrupted by violence, of the mind reaching for home only to be yanked back to the immediate reality of danger, was the texture of those men's existence." What is perhaps most striking in these fragments is not the expression of fear or regret, but the strange persistence of routine. In one letter, a German soldier describes the peculiar care with which men would clean their rifles, or ration their water, or swap information about where the next meal might come from. There was comfort in small acts of order and discipline, even when the larger situation had become disordered beyond recovery. It is as if the mind, faced with chaos it cannot control, seizes on the tiny things that can still be managed. A radio operator with the 21st Panzer Division, in notes scribbled to himself, made observations about his fellow soldiers that were almost anthropological in their distance. "Müller has stopped talking entirely. He sits and stares at nothing. Braun hums to himself, always the same tune. A folk song, I think, though I can barely hear it under the noise. Fischer jokes constantly, laughing at things that are not funny. Are we all breaking, I wonder, each in our own way? Or is this what survival looks like?" The question itself reveals a man trying to make sense of what the human mind can endure. As the summer wore on and the Falaise encirclement tightened, the tone in these fragments shifted almost imperceptibly towards something like acceptance. Not surrender, precisely, but a quieter reckoning with the narrowing of possibility. A soldier with the 7th Army, writing in early August, as German forces were being compressed into an ever smaller pocket, made an entry that is almost dreamlike in its detachment. "We received orders to hold our position. Hold it with what? With whom? Half the men in my unit are casualties, or missing. The others are hollow-eyed and silent. I wonder if those who have already been killed are not the fortunate ones. At least they have stopped waiting." There is a terrible kind of mercy in that thought, the notion that the battle itself had become so consuming, so all-encompassing, that death might come almost as relief. It is not the sentiment one finds in propaganda or official histories, but it is the sentiment that floats beneath the surface of these private documents, the weight of accumulated trauma and exhaustion, and the slow erosion of hope. What we can sense, reading between these fragmentary lines, is the peculiar isolation of the individual soldier in the midst of a vast military failure. He did not understand, fully, why the panzers had been delayed. He could not know about the rivalries between Rommel and Rundstedt, or Hitler's sleep, or the miscalculations of the high command. All he knew was that the enemy kept coming, that his comrades kept falling, that promises made in June were being contradicted by the reality of August. The machinery of history was grinding forward, and he was caught inside it, crushed slowly by forces he could neither see nor influence. And yet, and this is what lingers in these documents, long after we have read them, there is a human dignity in the simple fact that these men continued. They fought, they endured, they tried to hold positions they knew were indefensible. They looked out for one another in the darkness. They went on, one moment after another, even as hope was being systematically drained away. It is not glory, it is something quieter and perhaps more true. It is the weight of being human in the presence of overwhelming power and the stubborn refusal to disappear entirely, even when disappearance seemed inevitable. And so when the historians gathered in the decades that followed, sifting through captured documents and the worn journals of men who had lived that week, a quieter story emerged than the thunder of invasion beaches, a story of intelligence that had been fractured, then splintered, and finally shattered across the Channel. The Germans, for all their reputation for precision and cold calculation, had made a fundamental error, not of strategy or courage, but of belief. They believed they knew what was coming, and believing this, they ceased to truly see what was arriving. The intelligence apparatus that had served Hitler's war machine had begun, by 1944, to operate in a kind of waking sleep. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been staffed with increasingly compromised operators, men who had been turned, or who had learned to feed information that pleased their masters, rather than information that was true. By the time Fortitude's ghost armies gathered in England, sending phantom radio signals into the ether, the German listening posts were primed to hear exactly what they expected to hear. A single intercepted message about troop movements in southeast England, when repeated through the fog of weeks of similar reports, became indistinguishable from certainty. The mind, once convinced, tends to arrange all subsequent evidence around that conviction. We see what we believe we will see. The 15th Army, stationed north of the Seine, remained committed to the defense of Pas-de-Calais because the reports, the accumulated, seemingly overwhelming reports, insisted this was where the invasion would break. Von Rundstedt himself had accepted this assessment, and with his acceptance came a kind of gravitational pull that kept divisions locked in place, waiting. These were not wasted forces, precisely, but they were forces held in the wrong pattern, arranged according to a hypothesis that had been carefully constructed across the Channel by British intelligence officers and American planners who understood, with almost anthropological precision, how German minds would process information. And yet there was more to it than mere deception, significant as that was. There had also been a profound misjudgment about Allied capabilities, a failure to fully appreciate what the transformation of American industrial power meant when measured in landing craft, in ammunition, in aircraft. The German High Command had been operating with estimates from 1942 and 1943, figures that had not kept pace with the vast mobilization happening across the Atlantic. They expected an invasion, yes, but they expected it in a shape and scale that their own experience could contain. They had not quite accepted that total war meant something different when one side possessed, by 1944, an industrial capacity that dwarfed any previous measure. The overextension was real too, though it operated in layers. Hitler, casting his eye across the map of occupied Europe, had spread his divisions thin across the Atlantic Wall itself, thousands of miles of coastline defended by fewer men than a successful invasion would require to even beachhead. The calculation, if we can call it that, had been based partly on hope that Fortitude's deceptions would keep the 15th Army committed north, that the landings, when they came, could be contained in their first days, that reserves could flow toward the crisis before it became catastrophic. But hope, when embedded in military planning, has a tendency to become something else, a slow toxin that clouds judgment. The tangled chain of command, which we have seen before, created a kind of organizational inertia that transformed small errors into cascading failures. A message delayed by an hour became a message delayed by 4 hours when it had to travel up to Rundstedt's headquarters, then across to Rommel's, then back down through subordinate commanders who each had to verify authenticity and authorization. By the time clarity might have emerged, the fog of the night of June 5th had already settled over the Norman coast, and the paratroopers were descending. The organizational structure that had worked adequately for occupation and consolidation, the overlapping authorities, the checks and balances that prevented any single general from becoming too powerful, now functioned as a paralytic. Fuel, that mundane substance, became a philosophy of constraint. The panzer divisions that might have responded with vigor to the invasion threat were already rolling on fuel rationed, carefully, weeks in advance. Moving armor meant consuming petroleum that could not be easily replaced, and the men in command knew this with an almost painful clarity. Every kilometer toward Normandy was a kilometer away from other defensive positions. Every sortie burned fuel that might be needed later. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was fading. By 1944, the American and British air forces had achieved something like dominion over the Channel and the Norman skies, which meant that any daylight movement of German armor was movement into a kind of furnace. Consider the accumulated weight of these errors, not any single catastrophic mistake, but rather the slow accumulation of small misjudgments, each compounding the others. The intelligence failure convinced them Calais was the target, so divisions remained locked in place. The overestimation of the Atlantic Wall's readiness meant fewer reserves behind it. The organizational chaos meant those reserves, such as they were, moved with ponderous slowness. The fuel shortages meant they moved with great caution. The air supremacy meant they moved only at night, which meant they moved slowly. Each constraint fed the others. Each error amplified those around it. This is how catastrophes often arrive, not in a single thunderbolt, but in a gathering of small shadows that gradually obscure the light. There is something almost tragic in reviewing these records, in reading the notes and messages that passed between German commanders, as they slowly, almost reluctantly, began to understand what was happening. The recognition came not all at once, but in stages. First disbelief, then a careful hope that this might be the feint, that the real invasion would still come elsewhere, then a dawning comprehension that the game had shifted, that Normandy was not a diversionary landing, but the main assault. By then, the window for effective response had already closed. The lesson, if we can call it such, is not that Germany lost because its officers were incompetent or cowardly. Many were neither. Rather, they lost because even the most sophisticated military organization cannot entirely escape the constraints of geography, of industrial capacity, of the psychological effects of anticipating an event that can occur in only one of several possible places. They had to defend everywhere. The Allies had only to succeed somewhere. That mathematical asymmetry, that fundamental inequality of the problem itself, was perhaps the most important intelligence of all, and it was something no intercepted message could have conveyed. If you were to walk the fields of Normandy on an ordinary summer afternoon, you might notice how little remains of that June chaos. The tourists scatter across the bluffs and beaches in small groups, their voices carried away by the same Atlantic wind that once carried the roar of engines and artillery. The farmland around the bocage has grown thick and green again, almost deliberately peaceful, as if the earth itself has chosen to forget what it held beneath the mud and broken tanks. Yet forgetting is never truly complete. Beneath the orderly rows of crops and wildflowers, there are still fragments, twisted metal, unexploded ordnance, the occasional artifact that the plough turns up after 70 years of silence. Local farmers know the signs. They know which fields to be careful in, and in the early mornings, before the day warms, there's a particular quality to the mist that rolls across those hedgerows, a stillness that seems to carry memory in its moisture. The Germans who survived that campaign, those who lived past the Falaise encirclement and the desperate months of retreat, often spoke in their final years about how quickly the terror faded from their minds. even as it never quite left. One cannot precisely measure such things, but perhaps it is the way of terrible violence. It burns so intensely while it is happening that the mind, as a mercy, allows it to cool more swiftly than one might expect. Yet something lingers. Something settles into the soil and the stones, into the testimonies and the photographs, into the very geography of a place where so many young men made decisions under impossible weight. Consider for a moment what it meant to be a German soldier on those Norman beaches, or in those hedgerows, knowing with increasing clarity that the war could not be won. Not because they had heard some secret radio broadcast or possessed special insight, but simply because they could feel it in the overwhelming organization of the enemy, in the endless waves of supplies and men, in the sky that was no longer theirs. They had grown up in an ideology that promised invincibility, and now they were watching that promise dissolve in real time. That particular form of disillusionment, I think, leaves its own kind of shadow. It settles differently than the memory of enemy fire or hunger or exhaustion. The historians and the veterans' children, and the endless stream of researchers and amateur enthusiasts who visit Normandy today, often ask the same central question, in slightly different words. How could an army with such advantages, fortified positions, knowledge of the coming invasion, interior lines of communication, fail so comprehensively? The answer, as we have traced through the smoke and the command posts and the fractured egos of the high command, is never simple. It was never one failure. It was the accumulation of smaller failures, each one seemingly manageable in isolation, that together created an unstoppable cascade. There was the intelligence failure, though intelligence is always a gamble. There was the strategic disagreement between Rommel and Rundstedt, and while disagreement itself is not failure, the failure to resolve it quickly was. There was Hitler, asleep in Berchtesgaden, unreachable by the men who needed to move tanks. There was the fuel shortage, which seems almost mundane compared to the grand strategic narratives, but which turned armor into static gun positions. There was the sheer power of American logistics and British stubbornness, combined in a way that overwhelmed the most sophisticated defensive line ever constructed. And there was, perhaps most of all, the simple fact that the Germans were fighting a two-front war, that they could not concentrate their strength anywhere without leaving another part of their world desperately vulnerable. If you sit on one of the cliffs overlooking Omaha Beach, as the light begins to fade, you can almost imagine the shape of that morning. The sky grows soft and uncertain, the way it must have been in those pre-dawn hours when men climbed down the nets from ships into landing craft. The waves break with a particular rhythm that has not changed, that will not change, and there is something almost painfully ordinary about it all. The beach is just a beach. The water is just water, and yet everything that happened there remains somehow impossible to fully comprehend, suspended in the space between fact and mystery. The fields further inland, the ones where the bocage still stands dense and green, hold their own kind of quietness. These are the fields where soldiers fought yard by yard, where armor became trapped in lanes too narrow for maneuver, where the most technologically advanced army in the world found itself fighting almost like infantry from another age. Walk through them now, and you feel how the terrain would have suffocated movement, how every hedgerow would have been a potential grave. It is easy to imagine why Rommel wanted his panzers close, why he wanted them ready to pounce on the invader in the first hours. It is equally easy to imagine why Rundstedt wanted to hold them back, to wait for perfect clarity about where the real blow would fall. Both men were thinking rationally. Both were answering to impossible constraints. Both were, in the end, overruled or outmaneuvered, or simply caught in circumstances that no amount of brilliance could have fully navigated. There is something almost merciful about how nature works on such places. The hedgerows grow back thicker than before. The fields are ploughed and planted and harvested, year after year, until the disruption becomes merely history. The bunkers remain, but they are museums now, with careful plaques and interpretive signs, transformed from instruments of war into containers for memory. And memory itself, especially as time stretches forward, becomes gentler. the sharp edges of fear and loss begin to round. What was once immediate terror becomes narrative. What was once the end of the world becomes a chapter in a larger story. Yet if you visit on certain mornings, when the fog rolls in thick from the sea and the hedgerows disappear into mist, you might feel something else entirely. You might feel, for just a moment, what it was like to be uncertain, to move through obscurity,